we thank you all for joining us today for this presentation with Avadel Pharmaceuticals. We're really pleased to bring this important topic to you today. And we encourage you and remind you that MOBIO Breakthrough is that virtual program that's offered up to all of our member businesses. And please take advantage of it as you determine that you've got science that other members across the state of Missouri and beyond need to know about, should know about, and or developments with your company in terms of progress or in new leadership, or you just need to provide a perhaps a panel discussion to help solve a problem. So I want to thank you for joining today. This program, as we've invited people, has turned out to be exceptionally popular. We're right up against our 100-person limit that Zoom puts on these calls. And again, we're very appreciative of folks signing on to this. Also, exciting times here at the Missouri Biotechnology Association in that your team, Michelle Lumpkins and Lisa Zimmerman and myself, are working feverishly on a new front door, a new association headquarters, if you will, through our mobio.org website. And so we're doing a lot of things right here at the end of March in moving from one web host provider to another one on April the 1st. And so if you have any links that aren't working right currently at the moment, give us a break for about a week and check back then, because we're very excited about a new streamlined hosted website that will, I think, serve our members stronger. In addition, we're doing all that back-end work that's necessary for moving an association's 100+ member contacts, the key representatives for each of those contacts and the individual contact members that belong to each one of those member companies, as well as taking care of our general contacts and our prospects and our leads and our other community allies that need to be kept informed of MOBIO activities and communications. So with that as an explanation, one of my asks of our attendees today is take a moment. You know that our emails are always our first name at mobio.org. So send to Michelle at mobio.org or Kelly at mobio.org your business signature block or your business card so that we can make sure that your data is updated on the back end. And we would sure appreciate that. If you have the interest, this is a perfect time to request the other members, the other individual contacts that we would say have listed for Avadel. And we want to make sure that those are current, that those are the ones that should be getting the newsletter or invitations to events. So please, simple request, send us your signature block so that we can check it, make sure that we have as up to date as possible for you. And with that, I'm really pleased to introduce Jennifer Gudeman, who is the Vice President for Medical and Clinical Affairs with Avadel Pharmaceuticals. And for those of us that are kind of in tune with from health to precision medicine, you know that it really matters what we put in our food, in our bodies, is in terms of food, the exercise that we all tend to fall short of doing and should be doing for healthy balance. And then the third thing the docs always ask us is, how are you sleeping? And are you getting the necessary rest to prepare your body to attack the next day? And we're really pleased that this important conversation includes the science behind really some breakthrough technology in this territory. Jennifer, would you kick us off from here?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that kind introduction, Kelly. And just for everyone on the phone, as Kelly said, my name is Jennifer Gudeman. I also have two colleagues with me, Dr. Dave Seiden, who is a neurologist and sleep medicine specialist. He is our senior medical director. And I have Dr. Jason Vaughn, who is our senior vice president of technical operations. So I believe we'll have some time for questions at the end that I certainly may call upon my colleagues to join me in. But I'm thrilled to have this time with all of you to share an update of what we're focused on at Avadel in terms of advancing the treatment of narcolepsy through our novel drug delivery technology platform. So I've set forth 3 objectives to cover. I first just want to introduce you to who we are at Avadel and what our aspiration is to ultimately improve the lives of people who are living with this chronic condition of narcolepsy. We'll segue pretty quickly into what our technology is and why we believe that it holds a breakthrough for patients. And then we'll wrap up by seeing how this novel technology ultimately translates into efficacy and safety. So first, just a little bit about Avadel. We're headquartered in Dublin, Ireland. Our US headquarters are in Chesterfield, Missouri. So for those of you not familiar, this is a suburb about 20 to 30 minutes, depending upon how you drive, outside of St. Louis, Missouri. And our team has 30 years of R&D experience in terms of applying proprietary technology platforms with the goal of ultimately improving the standard of care for patients. I think that most on this call are familiar with the fact that it is typically quite a lengthy process from concept ultimately through to FDA approval. And the investigational compound that I'm talking about today is no different. So the early proof of concept work started about a decade ago. Avadel reached a really important and exciting milestone for us in December with the submission of the new drug application to the FDA. So our compound is currently under review at FDA with a target action date of October 15th of this year, recently granted. I want to begin by talking a little bit about narcolepsy. This is an orphan condition, and so I imagine that most on the call may not have a solid understanding of this condition. And I think that's true, and certainly something that we're looking to remedy by providing education and background. So there is a pentad of symptoms that characterize narcolepsy depicted here. And just from a big picture perspective, this is a chronic neurologic condition. So at the point that a patient is diagnosed, this is a condition that will require symptomatic management, typically throughout the remainder of their lives. And quite simply, with narcolepsy, there is an inability for these people's brains to regulate their sleep-wake cycles. The cardinal symptom is excessive daytime sleepiness, which is abbreviated EDS. And this isn't the typical grogginess that many of us will experience at certain points during the day. This is described as an irresistible and overwhelming urge to fall asleep. And of course, it can often happen at inopportune moments, such as sitting in a lecture if you're a student, being in a business meeting, or even stopped at a stoplight driving a car. Narcolepsy is divided into 2 types. Type 1 narcolepsy also has cataplexy, and cataplexy is the sudden loss of muscle control. It's triggered typically by an emotional response. It could be something as simple as laughter, happiness, surprise, or anger. And cataplexy, with this loss of muscle control, can be something very dramatic where a person would suddenly just crumple to the ground. Or oftentimes it's extremely subtle. It could be a slight drooping of the face, a slurring of the words. One thing that's very interesting to me is that oftentimes when people are successfully treated, they'll notice that they're no longer the clumsy person that they once thought. So reflecting back that cataplexy may have been to play if they were dropping items. Now, as we look at the bottom left-hand side of the screen, I think there are 3 symptoms that maybe don't receive as much attention. So Disturbed nocturnal sleep, also sometimes referred to as disrupted nighttime sleep, is frequently seen in people who are living with narcolepsy. This is characterized by frequent awakenings and arousals and frequent shifts between the various stages of sleep. So in people without sleep disorders, we typically want to see consolidated sleep where there's a good amount of time that is spent in deep sleep, in slow wave sleep, which is considered to be the restorative type of sleep. And for people living with narcolepsy, there are these constant shifts in and out of lighter stages of sleep and into REM sleep. So also what may accompany this is a feeling of being paralyzed, as well as extremely vivid hallucinations upon either falling asleep or waking up, which can be quite frightening for the patient. So I mentioned that narcolepsy is an orphan condition. About 1 in 2,000 people are believed to be affected by narcolepsy. There are many people living with this chronic condition who have never even met another person with this diagnosis, which can be very isolating. And adding to that isolation and that frustration is the fact that on average, it takes about 8 to 15 years before an appropriate diagnosis is ultimately made. The FDA hosted a Voice of the Patient in 2013, where they invited people living with narcolepsy, as well as family members and caregivers, to provide their perspective about this chronic condition. And I've pulled out a couple of quotes from the FDA report. I think for all of us, just as Kelly had described in the introduction, sleep is such an important aspect of allowing us to function. And so for people with this sleep disorder, it is a debilitating condition. And not surprisingly, it can impact virtually every facet of their life, even negatively impacting their ability to be employed, to have financial success. And I think one of the aspects that is so motivating to me in terms of our aspiration to improve this area is to overcome the stigma that people living with narcolepsy may be labeled. You can see some of the words that arose out of this FDA Voice of the Patient is being characterized as lazy, careless, or incapable. Unfortunately, there's very strong patient advocacy in this therapeutic area that is working to bring awareness, to bring education, and to also help the pharmaceutical industry understand what's important as we work to advance therapies. So transitioning into pharmacotherapy, you can see that pentad of symptoms that I described at the very beginning. And for many decades, excessive daytime sleepiness was the only symptom for which there was effective therapy. So going back many decades to the amphetamine-based agents, methylphenidate, dextroamphetamine, these are Schedule II because of the addictive potential. In the late 90s and early 2000s, there were newer agents, which are Schedule III, that were added, specifically modafinil and armodafinil, and then even more recently with solriamfetol. Now, remembering that cataplexy, that's the loss of muscle control. And we look and see pitolisant is a new chemical entity that was approved in 2019, originally for excessive daytime sleepiness. That indication was expanded to include cataplexy. I'm going to be talking about sodium oxybate for the remainder of our time together. And sodium oxybate was approved originally in 2002 for cataplexy. The indication was expanded in 2005 for excessive daytime sleepiness. The leading medical society in this therapeutic area is the American Academy of Sleep Medicine. And this academy recognizes that sodium oxybate is also a standard treatment for disturbed nocturnal sleep and may also possibly improve sleep paralysis as well as hallucinations. So you may be familiar with GHB. This is an endogenously occurring compound. It was first discovered in 1960 and unfortunately emerged as a quote unquote party drug in the 1990s. The sodium salt of GHB is sodium oxybate. So upon ingesting sodium oxybate for the approved indication of excessive daytime sleepiness or cataplexy with the original immediate release formulation, the medication has a short half-life of only 30 minutes to 1 hour. So probably there's people familiar on this call with a basic tenet of pharmacology is it's only about 4 to 5 half-lives before a medication is essentially eliminated from the body. And if we look at immediate release, we can do the math and see that after about 2 hours to at most 5 hours, that is going to mean that immediate release sodium oxybate is no longer present to exert its therapeutic effect. This would make sodium oxybate a prime target to apply modified release technology, but it has not occurred for close to 2 decades because the drug moiety itself has some challenges. Specifically, this is highly water soluble and it's dosed in a high dose of grams, not milligrams, not micrograms. And so with those two factors, many of the traditional modified release mechanisms cannot be applied to this drug moiety. And that's resulted in the 2 decades of twice a night dosing. So as I mentioned, sodium oxybate was originally approved in 2002. The current formulations are immediate release. And what this means is if you're a person with this chronic condition of narcolepsy, you would take your first dose in the bed and then awaken 2.5 to 4 hours later to take your second dose. For people who don't have this sleep disorder, that is likely pretty difficult to fathom, to imagine night after night, taking the first dose, waking up 2.5 to 4 hours later to take the second dose. Despite that regimen, there is no question that sodium oxybate has been transformational for people who are living with narcolepsy. I'll go back to that FDA voice of the patient that I mentioned earlier, and some of the direct descriptors from patients referring to sodium oxybate were that it's a wonder drug, that it's a miracle, and that without it, they're not functional. One of the questions that FDA asked at this voice of the patient is, assuming there's no complete cure for your condition, what specific things would you look for in an ideal therapy for your condition? So a response that's quoted here verbatim is looking for a medication that would provide consistent, adequate control of the daytime sleepiness with 1 dose taken at bedtime, resulting in 8 hours of restorative sleep. Which brings me to my introduction of our investigational compound, what we refer to as FT218, or the once nightly sodium oxybate. So first, an introduction to our technology. MicroPump technology platform has been previously applied to a medication in cardiovascular medicine, Coreg from GlaxoSmithKline. And what we can see with the cartoon depicting is that we have a blend of immediate release microparticles listed on the left, controlled release microparticles on the right. So there is a neutral core in both microparticles. The yellow represents the drug-loaded layer. This is where the sodium oxybate surrounds the inert core. On the controlled release microparticle, there is a specialized coating which is applied, which helps to make this resistant to the acidic environment in the stomach. So the immediate release microparticles will hit the stomach where the pH, as we all know, is low. There will be a quick dissolution. And then we see the microparticles having that ability to resist the dissolution and be absorbed later. And we'll see how that translates in a PK profile. Practically speaking, what patients receive are pre-measured packets of microgranules, and the patients would then pour those granules into water at bedside. So they make a suspension extemporaneously prior to administration. Before I move into some of the specifics, just an overview, we have completed 10 PK studies to date in more than 250 healthy volunteers at a range of doses from 4.5 grams up to 9 grams. The adverse reactions that have been recorded have been consistent with what are known to be side effects of immediate release sodium oxybate. These are largely tolerability issues, many of them GI in nature. For FT218, the majority have been assessed as mild to moderate. So I'm going to introduce two quick PK studies. The first is the proof of concept. So this was the initial study to examine our technology. And what's depicted right now is the immediate release, the twice nightly sodium oxybate. So we see that after ingestion, there is a Cmax that occurs quickly, and then there's a rapid decline, necessitating to have that second dose again taken. And we see that the second Cmax is higher. This is probably due to having some residual drug left in the system, as well as being in more of a fasted state in the middle of the night. When we look at FT218, the once nightly sodium oxybate, this first proof of concept examined 3 different prototypes. As I mentioned in the beginning, there can be adjustments to the blend of IR to CR, as well as adjustments to the coding. And what the developers honed in on was prototype 2. The area under the curve, so the overall systemic drug exposure, was essentially the same as the twice nightly sodium oxybate. We see a lower level of maximum concentration and a lower concentration at 8 hours. Fast forwarding to one of the most recent PK studies is a bioavailability comparison. And again, what's depicted in gray is the twice nightly immediate release sodium oxybate. We see the 2 Cmaxes. So here's where the second dose is given. Here's where the second higher Cmax is. And with the FT218, the once nightly sodium oxybate, there is the initial Cmax, and then there's a slow decline over the period of time that a patient would be sleeping, allowing them not to take that second middle of the night dose. This proprietary technology informed the hypothesis as we moved into our pivotal phase 3 clinical trial, what we refer to as REST ON, that we would likely see efficacy in terms of dosing. But of course, you've got to conduct the randomized controlled trial. In this case, we had 212 people with narcolepsy. These were adults with narcolepsy. And in the interest of time, I'm going to move directly into presenting the 3 co-primary endpoints. So let me first explain, we wanted to evaluate the safety and efficacy of 3 doses of FT218. And so in the trial, there was a forced titration where all participants in the active arm would go through an initial dose of 4.5 grams for titration for 1 week. Then they would move into a 6-gram dose. The first point of evaluation was at week 3. And then we have them subsequently moving into a 7.5-gram dose, and ultimately the highest dose that was assessed, which was 9 grams. So this is the maintenance of wakefulness test. And I don't know if we do have sleep medicine specialists on the line. I would hazard a guess that many people may not be familiar with what this endpoint is. So a quick explanation. People with narcolepsy are placed in a darkened room and asked to try to stay awake, not to take extraordinary measures, but to try to stay awake. And that time is measured. At baseline, in both the placebo and the active arm, the average time that the participants stayed awake was 5 minutes. What we see at week 3 is that there was an 8-minute length that they were able to stay awake. And the difference between this and placebo is close to 5. And I will also say with all 3 of our co-primary endpoints and all 3 of our doses, they had p-values that were less than 0.001. So highly statistically significant in terms of the effect of FT218. And you can see by virtue of the line graph that not only was there a quick separation from placebo with significant results seen at week 3, but those results were sustained and even continued to improve over time with the highest dose that was assessed of 9 grams at week 13. Going on, we've got the Clinical Global Impression of Improvement, what's called the CGI-I. And in this case, clinicians who were caring for these participants were asked to rank their assessment of how patient improvement occurred. This was a 7-point Likert scale where responders were considered those that clinicians ranked as much or very much improved. Once again, you see a quick separation between FT218, the once nightly sodium oxybate, and placebo. That continues over time and continues to increase. And so if we just focus on the 9-gram dose, close to 3/4 of the participants receiving once nightly sodium oxybate were assessed to be much or very much improved by the clinicians who were treating them. Obviously, in every trial, the reason you have a placebo is we know there's going to be a placebo response. We see less than 1/3 of the placebo participants had that ranking of much or very much improved. And then, as I mentioned in the beginning, there's 2 types of narcolepsy. So type 1 is where cataplexy is also present. We had about 75% of participants who had type 1 narcolepsy, meaning that they had cataplexy. And once again, we see that there was this rapid decline. The initial assessment, even at 4.5 grams at week 1, was statistically significant from placebo, showing a reduction in cataplexy attacks. And we see that that just continued as these participants were in the trial for a longer duration and as they progressed through both the 7.5 gram dose as well as the 9-gram dose. Of course, safety is an important consideration for any medication. And so what's depicted here are adverse reactions over time. As I mentioned, in the first week, this was an initial titration on 4.5 grams. The 3 doses that are under review are 6 grams, 7.5 grams, and 9 grams. What you can see corresponding are the adverse reactions over time. So I first want to highlight the fact that the y-axis is only going up to 10. All of these adverse reactions were less than 10%, most of them well below that. I think the other important point to recognize is that as the participants got acclimated to sodium oxybate, there was a decline in the adverse reactions. So specifically, as we're looking at something like enuresis, which is bedwetting, we see that that increased at the first highest dose of 9 grams, and then it declined with each week thereafter. And this is a known and recognized side effect of sodium oxybate. So to wrap up, we're very pleased with our data and we're very excited at what it may hold for patients. As I mentioned, in our pivotal trial, we had 3 co-primary pre-specified endpoints. FT218 demonstrated a statistically significant improvement at all 3 of those doses for all 3 of those co-primary endpoints. We also demonstrated improvements in secondary endpoints, including disturbed nocturnal sleep. There were no new safety concerns that were raised throughout this clinical development program. The adverse reactions were consistent with known tolerability events associated with oxybate. As I mentioned in the very beginning, our drug is not yet FDA approved. It is currently under review with a PDUFA date of October 15th of this year. We believe that if FT218 is approved, that it will be a breakthrough for people who are living with this chronic condition, as it will be the only oxybate formulation which is administered as a once nightly regimen. We're committed to working with advocates and patients and the medical community for our aspiration of improving the lives of people who are living with this chronic condition. And to wrap up, and hopefully I haven't taken too much time, our sincere gratitude to the patients who participated in our trial, as well as the healthy volunteers, all of the researchers as well. And with that, I'm happy to pause and take questions.
Jennifer, thank you. I'm going to open the field up to anyone that would like to ask questions. Make sure you unmute yourself. And
so Jennifer, this is Bobby Sandage. Can I ask a quick question?
Yes, I'd love for you to, Bobby.
So on slide 16, well, in fact, all your efficacy slides, the placebo patients actually got better following the dose thing. It's just a very curious finding why, I can understand placebo responses, but they actually followed the increase in dosing. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes, great question, Bobby. It's something that we've talked about internally. It's actually something that we'll be describing in a manuscript that we hope will be published soon. So we all know that there's a placebo response. I think one thing that is surprising is sometimes you even see a placebo response in outcomes that are totally objective in measure. It's been shown in the literature that antihypertensives even will have a placebo response. The mind is incredibly powerful. We believe that because the participants were informed that there would be this forced titration where they're stepping through, if they're in the active arm and they're going from 6 grams to 7.5 grams to 9 grams, it's pretty well acknowledged in both the medical and patient community that you do see a dose response effect in regard to efficacy. And so it's our belief that because the placebo patients knew that if they were in the active arm, they would be going through that same forced titration, that it's not completely unexpected that there was an increase at each of the points where that dose increase occurred.
Did the placebo patients actually get a larger quantity of placebo?
These were identical in terms of the appearance. So as it changed for the 6 grams to go to the 7.5 grams, it was identical to match for the placebo. So they did have a difference visually in terms of what they were taking.
Is this mixed in a packet and put in water like the immediate release?
So the immediate release is an oral solution. It's 500 milligrams per ml. It's an oral solution. This is in a packet, in a pre-measured packet that is suspended extemporaneously in water before it's dosed.
And one more question on your side effects. As it went down, as the incidence of enuresis went down, are those the same patients that didn't experience it, or later in 11 weeks or 13 weeks, is that a new patient that just experienced it for the first time?
So Bobby, that's a good question that I don't know the answer to. I have our medical director on standby. Dave, if you could take yourself off of mute, if you know, it may be that we don't have that data at our fingertips.
I don't have that data right at my fingertips, but this is the percentage of patients overall. So I believe it's not necessarily the same patient, but I would have to confirm that.
Thank you. It's a great presentation. Really interesting drug. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Bobby. Appreciate your interest.
This is Damon Broyles with Mercy. Had a question around the drug delivery technology. Wondering if the Avadel team has thoughts about other clinical conditions and compounds that it might be useful for going forward.
Yes, thank you so much for your question. So not a whole lot that can be shared in specifics, but certainly Avadel is evaluating where else our technology platforms could be applied. And one of the anecdotes that I find so interesting is that sodium oxybate, how this became the focus for Avadel was a member of the team actually had narcolepsy and brought forth the concept of sodium oxybate being really an optimal active pharmaceutical ingredient to apply a modified release technology. So I love that story. I don't think you can count on Kismet to always inform what you're doing next in terms of your drug development program. Sorry, I lost my ear pod. Hopefully you can hear me. But we are definitely evaluating future applications. And Kelly, can I just ask, I have one AirPod out. Can you still hear me, or should I reach under my desk?
Oh, you're doing great, Jennifer.
Okay.
I've got a question for for Jennifer or Dr. Seiden. Does the fact that GHB have that reputation of date rape drug in the past. Is that going to be an issue? How's your approval process dealing with that? Are there any curveballs with that? And how do you get ahead of that issue?
Yeah, Dave, do you mind if I take that first, and then I'm going to ask you to fill anything that I missed or that I got wrong. But
Sure.
I'm glad, Kelly, that you bring this up. And this is a place where I think it's really important to acknowledge the initial company doing a great job of bringing sodium oxybate to market in 2002, successfully gaining FDA approval with the immediate release formulation. If you consider that time in 2002, that was not long after really some of that negative overhang that you're referring to was out in the public kind of recognition. And so what FDA has required for any sort of sodium oxybate is that there's a REMS program, a risk evaluation and mitigation strategy, where there's a very controlled distribution of the medication to ensure that it is not being used for illicit purposes. And we have the benefit, Avadel has the benefit of coming to market after there has been almost 2 decades worth of utilization of sodium oxybate. And what has been borne out of that nearly 20 years is that because of the REMS, this is not a medication which is being diverted and is being used for those nefarious purposes. That being said, I think there still is a tremendous amount of education that's necessary between the sleep medicine physician and patients so that they're able to address and hopefully overcome those concerns. And Dave, you've been in practice, so please, bring your practical guidance to this.
Yeah, I agree with what Jen has said. She stated it very nicely. I would tell you that the data over the last 20 years with Xyrem is that, people living with narcolepsy do not abuse the drug. And I think much of the sort of hoopla around it and some of those nefarious dealings that were not happening with Xyrem. They were happening with, sort of homemade GHB. One of the things about Xyrem, for example, the currently available twice nightly sodium oxybate, is that it is, as Jennifer mentioned, a sodium salt. So it does have a salty taste for many patients, and would be difficult for some unscrupulous person to put it in someone's drink, for example, and to sort of go unnoticed because of that. But the reality is that it's just not a medication that's been abused. I mean, we've seen that over, as Jennifer mentioned, over 20 years of data.
Yeah, what our experience has been that the patients that are needing these products protect them with great effort and with great respect, but increasingly we also have those issues of drug diversion happening in professional healthcare settings, and a big issue for even broad healthcare systems to get on top of that, and not just in this territory, but in many other areas where legitimate products can be diverted away. Elizabeth, would you ask your question?
Sure. Hi, Jen. I was just wondering if the pediatric population was included in your clinical trial work.
Great question. So these were adults. These participants needed to be 16 and above. So currently we're only pursuing an indication in adults.
Thanks.
I believe Tim Ackerman had a question.
Yes, given the PK profile, I was wondering what could be concluded about the disturbed nocturnal sleep relative to the standard of care, because it looks like you get better coverage throughout the night.
So that is a wonderful question. And I know that Dave would love to share a response, but I'm going to ask him not to. And the simple reason is we are getting ready to have some data presented at 2 upcoming meetings. So the American Academy of Neurology is less than a month away. This is in April, where we'll be presenting some of the data. And then the sleep meeting, which is the official meeting of the American Academy of Sleep Medicine and the Sleep Research Society, that is in June. Between the two of those, we have 8 presentations and posters where we're going to go a lot more in depth about some of these secondary endpoints, including disturbed nocturnal sleep. So believe me, I would love to have Dave answer your question, but I don't want to run afoul of the embargo rules of those congresses.
But we can assume that we want patients to stay down once they go down at nighttime.
How I
That's
like
a
to
very good
sleep.
assumption.
It's a great goal.
Indeed.
So I have a question. This is more on the clinical side. The patients that I've come across who have been diagnosed with narcolepsy were usually much older than 16 years old. Can you talk a little bit about the barriers of patients actually getting the help that they need in identifying narcolepsy?
Yes, Dave, can I turn that to you?
Sure. So, I mean, it's a very good point. You know, the onset of the condition is often in younger individuals, you know, as early as 7 or 8 years old or in the teenage years. But there is a very well established issue with the diagnosis in that it's often delayed. And I think there's a variety of reasons for that delay in diagnosis. You know, one is it's a rare condition, that is narcolepsy. And it's not necessarily, I think, in the forefront of the sort of general practitioners' thinking on this. You know, even in some of the specialists that treat sleep disorders, it may not be in their in the forefront of their thinking either. Number one. I think number two, many of the symptoms that Jennifer nicely described earlier are often mislabeled as different symptoms. So for example, cataplexy, which she described as a loss of muscle weakness. Sometimes it could be subtle, you know, facial drooping, or sometimes it can be even more generalized where there may be a complete loss of generalized muscle control. You know, these sorts of things are often misconstrued as a syncopal episode or a fainting spell or a seizure, which are certainly, you know, much more common symptoms. Even with daytime sleepiness, you know, if your teenager is sleepy, you sort of chalk it up to just being a teenager. The hour, you know, he or she is having, you know, not great hours, sleep deprivation, and so forth, and even depression. So I think that for many of these reasons, the diagnosis is delayed.
Much appreciated. Oh, yes, sir, it does. Much appreciated. Now, with this technology that you all have come up with, where do you see the applications into other fields or in the development of other medications? Have you thought that far?
Yes, thank you for the question. This would be one that I would also love to turn over to Jason Vaughn, who is our Senior Vice President of Technical Operations, but there's really limited information in terms of what we're able to share right now as far as future applications. So I think what I need to leave you with is that we are absolutely evaluating where else our technology platforms could be applied to provide a meaningful clinical benefit to patients. So we look forward to sharing more where appropriate, but for right now, we're really focused on the once nightly sodium oxybate that's under review at FDA.
Jennifer, can you tell us at least whether it will be FT219 or FU218?
That is a wonderful question. I think that we might get a little bit more creative with our naming. I don't know. great internal debate at our organization. Do we say FT218 or do we say FT218? I think the consensus is we're going FT218. So that is the focus. But the most important thing is to understand it's once nightly sodium oxybate.
We've got Ed Tim on the call, and Ed at MOBIO Therapeutics taught me the early lessons back in 2005, 2006 about naming something like M2A versus the pill cam. So
thank you. I'll vote for the sake of all, we'll spare them how that came about.
But thank you for that lesson, Ed.
I will remind you, though, that I was the one that changed it.
Yes.
That's the important part.
Rocket science. Yes.
Exactly. Thank you, Kelly.
Any other questions for Dr. Seaton or Jennifer? It's been a great presentation. Zach?
Yeah, I've got a generalized question here. So with the way that Xyrem has recently come out with the lower sodium version, XyWave now, do you see this translating effectively to a lower sodium version as well, or is it starting out just that same high sodium treatment?
Yeah, I'm glad that you asked the question. So with the original immediate release sodium oxybate, what's known as the brand name of Xyrem, the labeling for that does note the fact that it has a high sodium content and that patients who have conditions that make them sensitive to salt intake should be aware of that additional sodium content. So the labeling, which we expect to have similar labeling, specifies those who are sensitive as being patients who have heart failure, renal failure, or hypertension. So this is a relatively small subset as we look at people living with narcolepsy. As Dave mentioned, oftentimes these are people who are diagnosed early in their life without any sort of comorbid conditions as those are specified. We also had an interest in understanding whether sodium oxybate confers any sort of increased cardiovascular risk. And so last year, Avadel had supported a publication in sleep medicine that was authored by two leading sleep medicine specialists, Dr. Alan Avedon and Dr. Cleet Kushida from UCLA and Stanford, respectively. And what they did was a systematic review of the nearly 20 years worth of sodium oxybate utilization. So in that time, there had been 4 randomized controlled trials in adults, 1 in pediatrics. There were multiple open label studies, observational studies, as well as post-marketing surveillance of more than 26,000 individuals taking sodium oxybate. So I give you this background to say that there was a robust data set available to examine whether there was a correlation between sodium oxybate and cardiovascular outcomes, including hypertension. And that systematic review did not identify any correlation with sodium oxybate and cardiovascular outcomes, including hypertension. So I think that can be very reassuring for both patients and clinicians that first and foremost, sleep doctors like Dr. Seiden are doing what's appropriate, and they're perhaps not using sodium oxybate, whether it's the original immediate release or our once nightly when we come to market, in people who have conditions like heart failure where they are sensitive to sodium intake. I also think it's important to recognize there's a lot of debate around what a safe level of sodium is. So after that publication that I'm referring to by Avedon and Kushida, the European Society of Cardiology came out with their recommendation that there's not evidence to support a sodium threshold of 2,300 milligrams, which is what is sometimes quoted here in the US, that the threshold should be raised to 5,000 milligrams based upon the evidence that is available. Sodium is a micronutrient that, like many micronutrients, has a J-shaped curve. And what they talk about, the European Society of Cardiology, and what is out in the literature in cardiovascular medicine, is that if there's too low of sodium ingestion, that can have negative health consequences. And if there's too high, going up above 5 grams, or some would even say 6 grams, that can have negative consequences. So I'll just take it back to the point that 2 decades worth of the immediate release sodium oxybate utilization, which has a similar sodium level to what we have with FT218, has shown no linkage between that and any sort of negative effects on heart health. May have gotten more information about sodium than you bargained for, but
no, I mean, honestly, it's something that I've talked about. I've got it. So, that's something that we've discussed with my physician as well. So it's just mostly trying to understand, having recently made the switch, if this is another opportunity there. So.
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad that you shared that. So I had no idea that there would be any people living with narcolepsy on this call. I hope I did okay. It really is, our ethos. Okay, good.
Hit the nail on the head.
It's good.
Even
I'm
down
so
to the
glad that you
cataplexy
joined.
piece, which I still find to be one of the funnier parts of the disease when you can laugh about it, but that's where we're at.
I am so pleased that you joined and that you were willing to share that you're one of the people living with narcolepsy that we're hoping to ultimately help.
Yeah, I definitely love the idea of not having to redose in the middle of the night. Can't remember the last time I got to sleep through a night, so this would be great fun.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you.
Zach, thank you for joining us today.
Of course.
I've had several private messages. You're not the only one on the call, by the way, that folks that are coming at it from the patient side. They're coming at it from just general interest from perhaps being a colleague or a manager. And so really important that we have lots of voices participating today. And so certainly welcome and thanks for joining. And what a great presentation. On behalf of MOBIO, Avadel team has done just a fantastic job today of raising the profile of not only the important work that you're doing, but its long-term benefit. We're really pleased and proud of the Missouri connection to such an important effort.
Thank you, Kelly. As a Missourian myself, I'm really pleased to be able to share, broadly what we're working on. So greatly appreciate the opportunity.
I wish we'd done this on March 17th, though, to honor the headquarters overseas with St. Patrick's Day. We could have had corned beef and cabbage and maybe some Guinness. So doggone it.
Missed opportunity. Maybe you can have us back March 17th of next year or sooner. We would happily come back sooner if you'd have us. Okay, so noted, and we'll record that on the on our yearly calendar. Sounds good.
Anything else for Avadel today? Because I've got one more announcement before we wrap up today.
No, I would just say my sincere thanks. I had included my email address at the beginning. If anyone wants to contact me, it's J Gudeman. It's just my first initial and my last name, Gudeman @avadel.com. So I know that we had a variety in terms of our audience today, and I'm always happy to engage and, particularly for patients or clinicians who are on the phone, continue to learn from all of you because it's a privilege to work in this space.
And Jennifer, I assume that you'd be more than willing to forward on to the appropriate people inside your company any inquiries like that are coming up. So
yes, absolutely.
Super. Then we'll make sure as follow up to this that we get your contact info out to the participants. Michelle and Lisa and I will figure out a way to make that happen. And want to thank everyone for participating in the MOBIO Breakthrough today. Just a fantastic program. On April the 28th, I don't know, maybe at noon, George Carrick at Sinclair. George, could you tell us if there's anything going on April 28th at noon?
Sure, Kelly. Yeah, Sinclair Research is going to be participating in the MOBIO Breakthrough.
And perhaps what would you be talking about? Maybe a growth expansion or how Missouri's helped your non-clinical safety testing industry? Would that be a possible program?
That might be it. Yeah, in the midst of the global consolidation in our non-clinical CRO market, Sinclair Research, a longtime fixture in the region, has emerged as one of the few CROs remaining that supports end-to-end IND enabling programs and animal health programs. And so we're just going to share a little bit about the growth trajectory over the past 2.5 years, including recent facility expansions, expanded service offerings, and this ability now that we're attracting top talent from the coasts that are actually relocating into Missouri and creating life science career opportunities in the region. We were 180 employees 2 years ago, and now we're up to 250 with continued plans for expansion of the year. So it's a pretty exciting time to be here, and we look forward to sharing that story with you.
Fantastic. George, thanks for that plug. Everybody's going to get that invitation. And our charge also this afternoon is to get hashtag FT218 trending. Okay. So let's promote that product, and I get a little revenue share on the FT219 if it ever comes to bear. Okay. Thank you, everyone. We are straight up at 1:59. Could not have planned it better. What a fantastic script Jennifer followed. And we thank Avadel for participating today. It was really a great show. Great program.